our last talk of the year, of the semester, yeah, the academic, of the, no, calendar year, there we go. But we will have a final reading room next Friday, if anybody wants to join for that. Today, we are joined by Dr. Henry Bowles, who is a visiting graduate student here this year. He's visiting from Oxford University, where he's doing a PhD in classical literature and language.
Yeah.
Literature. He has a PhD from Harvard in comparative literature as well, and some super interesting work from that. And he grew up in this area, so you might want to, if you're curious about Los Banos, he can fill you in on details about that.
Yes.
Today's going to be a little bit more of an interactive talk, and I will let him take it away. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were no Starbucks when I was a kid. Thank you so much. So in the clip you're about to see from Stand and Deliver, 1988 movie, Jaime Escalante, played by Edward James Olmos, teaches math at LA's Garfield High. Who knows Garfield High? Cool. So yeah, so this is based on a true story. So Garfield's about to lose accreditation, and Escalante's on a mission, and that is to change the school's culture by raising expectations. So in expectation theory, this is known as the Pygmalion effect, and Escalante says that people or students perform according to expectations. So he starts to prepare students for the AP Calc exam, and all the faculty are like, absolutely ridiculous. Mind you, this is a school where Escalante was supposed to teach computer science. They had no computers. So, and he meets these students, they lack rudimentary foundations in math, but he develops such great rapport with them. He gets them to agree to come in on Saturdays and do all this extra training. So they take the class, they take AP Calc, the exam, all 18 who take it pass. Garfield outperforms every high school in Southern California. And so what happens in the scene you're about to see is that the Educational Testing Service flags the scores. And what happens is they send investigators, they reveal the names, and they see that they're not Caucasian, essentially, and this is what Escalante is going to confront them about. And the investigation continues. So it's very fraught, and it's a fascinating scene. It's a great movie. Has anyone seen the movie? Yeah, it's a great movie. So just it'll be a productive way to begin our time together. So let us go right there. Yeah, I first saw it when I was in math class when I was, 11, and I rewatched it the other week, and it's so good. You watched an AP Calc? Okay, yes, wonderful. Okay. Can we up the volume a little bit? Or, all right.
Wrongdoing. I would have to see the test. Let me reiterate, there has been no proof of wrongdoing here, only a suspicion of cheating. In this country, one is innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around. If you're so confident of your students' abilities, regularity urge them to retest. Those scores would have never been questioned if my kids did not have assume they cheated. I would just.
All right. Well,
everyone will assume they cheated if they do.
I'm going to show you on my computer.
I want to see the test, please. Going around in circles here. Mr. Escalante, we're psychometricians, thorough to the point of boredom. We're not out to get anybody. Not so fast. If this was a simple situation of two students fighting, that's one of the proof of wrong. But by making a blanket accusation, you're saying that there was a conspiracy. Every conspiracy has a leader. Who better qualified to be the leader than the teacher? Mr. Escalante, nobody's accusing you here of anything. The school, the parents, the entire community. Scores aside, I guarantee you will be questioned regardless of the school. Yes, but if this was Beverly Hills High School, they wouldn't have sent you two to investigate. Well, hope you're not insinuating that we haven't earned our position. No one's giving me a bad thing. I suggest you letting your emotions get the best of you. If no one has given you a damn thing, you should not be taken away from my kids. The identity of the students were concealed until it was determined that irregularities existed. Those scores would have never been questioned if my kids did not have Spanish surnames and come from barrio schools. You know that. We've been patiently explaining our position and listening to your complaints, but now the conversation is over. There's something going on here that nobody's talking about. And you know what it is. No one has the right to accuse me of racism. No one has the right to accuse me of racism. You know, without discrimination. I thought this was over a long time ago. Are you doing it after my kids?
There are two kinds of racism, Mr. Escalante. Singling out a group because they're members of a minority and not singling out a group because they're members of a minority.
My kids could teach you a thing or two, Johnny.
I'm gonna call security if you can't control yourself, Escalante.
Go for it. You didn't show me the test. You didn't prove anything. My kids didn't do anything. I'm gonna prove you guys wrong. I hope you do. Because it's now between you and me. Give me that. If I catch you on the street, I'm gonna keep the shit out of you.
Sorry about the screen. Were you able to get kind of a flavor of the scene? Okay, great. All right. So after the clip, the 18 who originally passed retake it, and of course they pass again. And even more students pass in subsequent years. Escalante sets up basically a math program at Garfield, works really well, and that's what happens. So happy ending even after the movie ends. So in the course of our time together, I'm going to ask that you do three things. You have index cards in front of you. It's really three things in one thing in three parts. So I'm going to invite you to write down your thoughts, your questions, and your epiphanies on these cards. Now, and there are pens. Thank you so much. Yeah, there are pens, plenty of cards, and you do you. Organize it as you see fit. What I invite you to do is to do one card for T's, one for Q's, one for E's. And what this will help you do is to nail down do some brainstorming and nail down your thoughts on our primary sources. So we're looking at that, we saw that video clip, and then we're looking at 3 classical texts. And it'll help you nail down your thoughts, kind of play with the material, and then we're going to do some discussion together, and you can share what you wish. And so you'll have those. And I don't ever put people on the spot, but if you do, even if you don't share, just having them, it will help you maximize our time together. So a little bit of a roadmap. So I'm going to start by setting the scene, and then we'll do a group reading of those 3 classical texts, which are on your handout. Then we will discuss your TQEs. And then I'll offer some concluding remarks just to make sure that everything kind of gels. And then in our remaining time, I will open up the floor and we'll do a discussion. We'll do a Q&A. Now, before proceeding, I want to say thank you to the philosophy department. Thank you to UCM for having me here. Yeah, sit down anywhere. Anywhere is good. You can anywhere you'd like. You could absolutely go ahead. So I want to just say thank you to UCM for having me. As Carolyn mentioned, I grew up in the area in part. And so I remember when this university was first being talked about, it was so exciting. And so to be a part of it now, just even as a visiting grad student, is absolutely amazing. Thank you to Carolyn in particular for her amazing hospitality and their snacks and everything. So, all right, on that positive note, negative note, we have a problem. And the problem is something called the newness bias. Now, what does this refer to? And why is this in scare quotes? It's in scare quotes because Carolyn mentioned it to me when pitching this talk to me. So this refers to various ideas of conceiving of historiography. So we could think of words like developmentalist, organicist, evolutionist, historicist, teleological. In Greek, telos just means end. All of these point to this underlying idea of history as developing toward a fixed endpoint. Possible metaphor here would be like a staircase that goes upward, a single staircase that goes upward. You can't really go down it. And when you get to the top, you've arrived. Another metaphor would be a biological metaphor. And the discovery of a theory of evolution supercharged the development of historiography in the 19th century. So biological metaphor as well. People grow up. We become more conscious in theory. Plants grow. All of this is at play in these, when we conceive of history as that staircase or as developmentalist. And we then we're left with the newness bias, where what happens most recently is the most civilized or the endpoint. Deepesh Chakrabarty, who does a lot of work theorizing, he's at U of Chicago, does a lot of work theorizing history and these problems, has this great quote that is, to critique historicism or developmentalism or teleological thinking in all its varieties is to unlearn to think of history as a developmental process in which that which is possible becomes actual by tending to a future that's singular. So that would be that top of the staircase. Or to put it differently, it's to learn to think the present, the now that we inhabit as we speak, as irreducibly not one. So Chakrabarty talks about there being history twos, as many histories as we have lived concrete experiences. So to get there conceptually, we need to blow up the staircase. We need to kill the plant. Think about tessellations, chaos theory, string theory, something totally different to capture this more, to get a map that more accurately matches the territory of what we're describing, which is much more complex than a plant that grows up or a staircase that goes upward. So what are the costs of this newness bias? Well, there are three. There are lots, but three we can play with here. First is that we don't understand our informants on their own terms. Informants, this term just comes from anthropology. This means people we're studying. And so when we, even implicitly, and mostly implicitly now, because there's more opprobrium around being prejudiced, but when we criticize the people we study for not sharing our exact sociopolitical structures or not sharing our mores, it's like a genre mismatch. It really is like saying, oh, Saturday Night Live was really bad last week because it didn't make me cry out of sadness. It really is that much of a mismatch. Second cost, hegemonic thinking. So if we think that we have arrived at the top of the staircase, or that we are a plant in its prime, or whatever metaphor you would like, if we think we've arrived at the end of history, we are more apt to have a my way or the highway attitude. So hugely influential book at one time, no longer. But who knows this book, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama? Exactly, yeah. So written after the fall of the Berlin Wall, very dated now, after the fall of the Soviet Union. The thesis draws a 19th century historiography, Hegel in particular. The thesis is that liberal democracy is the fullest expression of our inner spirit, literally, genuinely, and that's basically how history is going to end. Well, of course, we know that's not true, but even if we implicitly have this kind of attitude, we are much more likely to engage in possibly unpleasant foreign political adventures. That's all I'm going to say, but you see where this has real, on the ground, concrete consequences, this kind of thinking. Third consequence, if we think we've arrived, we lose out on the past as a prism to reimagine our presence and future. So if we think that we are somehow the most civilized, we don't have the humility or the insight or the self-reflexivity to see how people at different times, different people grappled with the same moral issues that we're grappling with, and what light that could possibly shed on what we're doing. And we're going to play with all of this in our time together. So what are the solutions to these? Well, speaking of the 90s and 80s, first, we just invert these. So first solution would be thick description. This comes from the term comes from Gilbert Ryle. Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, popularizes it. And all this means is trying to understand our informants on their terms. How did they understand themselves? How did they understand their world? That's much more interesting than coming at it with kind of like a theoretical battering ram that puts them into cookie cutter concepts. This is much more nuanced, much more sensitive. And we're going to do that. One way of doing thick description is to do close analysis of text. And that's what we're going to do with this handout in part. So second solution is to get off the staircase, to think of there being heterotemporal horizons of innumerable histories. So lots of histories. We need some sort of new map to get to that territory that we're trying to describe. And then third, to quote the X-Files, use history to fight the future. That is, use history as a prism that could shed light on how we can better wage the moral debates that we're having right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is a case study. And the case study is the ancient Greek and Roman debate on talent. Whence the title of the talk? That's presumably why you came. This comes right out of my dissertation, my second dissertation I'm about to submit. So what we are going to look at are three texts as part of this case study. And the first is by Isocrates, the second is by Quintilian, and the third is by Longinus. Who are these people? You will soon know everything you need to know to make sense of these texts. The big idea in all of these texts, the big idea in everything in this handout is that talent is not fixed at birth. That talent is not fixed at birth. And so the idea here is that it's experience that creates talent. And an underlying metaphor would be, you hear the blank slate. So Aristotle plays with this metaphor, but it comes really from Descartes. And you could say blank slate. You could say, we're going to meet on the handout other metaphors like a vase that hasn't been, like a new vase, new ceramic. We could say a sponge, all this. And Steven Pinker in his book, The Blank Slate, kind of goes on and on, takes the metaphor really literally. But all this means is that it's experience that somehow shapes our aptitudes. That it's not at birth, it's what we learn by moving through the world. By formal education, of course, and then informal education, the things that we overhear, cultural osmosis, even nonverbal experience, all of this. In the history of ideas, the big duel is between innatism on the one hand, that's the idea that we're fixed somehow biologically for some metaphysical reason, whatever, versus blank slatism, versus what's known as empiricism. A good way to remember this is that in Greek, empiria just means experience. So the idea that it's experience first, not biology, or not whatever you're born with. And this debate foreshadows our own debates over Jaime Escalante's idea that anyone can learn anything. And it foreshadows other debates in interesting ways. So neuroplasticity versus evolutionary psychology, structural biases versus a meritocracy, the liberal arts versus vocational training. Are some people more suited to one than the other? This, you don't hear it explicitly that much, but these assumptions are very much at play in a lot of people's minds. And yeah. The most recent iteration would be the debate over STEM. Are some people more suited to STEM than others? Debates over school funding. Again, these models of mind, these debates over Escalante's idea that anyone can learn anything underlie this debate as well. And then the mindset. This comes out of Carol Dweck's work, has been really popular since the publication of her 2006 book. And what Dweck found is that it's our meta concepts of mind. If we think of our mind as being able to grow, or thinking of it as fixed, that this is an independent variable that affects our performance. She's been picked apart now a little bit in the replication crisis. I think she'll be vindicated ultimately, because I think we know kind of anecdotally she's right, but this is at play in that as well. Now, text one on your handout, we'll read these together, but this is setting the table, setting the scene. So text one, I Socrates, mind you, not Socrates. I'm in a war with Keynote and Word. It keeps correcting it to Socrates, who's better known, of course, as Plato's teacher. This is not him, but they were contemporaneous, and Socrates and Plato hated each other, basically hated each other. They had very different projects, as you're about to see. So a little bit of context on education in 5th and 4th century Athens. This is BCE, of course, BCE. Maybe not, of course, because we're going to fast forward to AD, to CE as well. So ancient Athens, a society where public speaking is absolutely of the essence. So 3 occasions to do so. Number 1, political. Any citizen could speak in the assembly, ecclesia, whence ecclesiastical. Now, citizens should be in scare quotes, of course. Everything should be in scare quotes. Everything's up for grabs. Here especially, because you had to be a male of a certain age. You had to be a citizen. This is qualified. Unpalatable now, but still path-breaking in the development of representational thought in Western political thought. So politics. Second would be ceremonial. So the Greeks were obviously, as we know, big on sports, big on religious festivals, and you could give speeches that had no function other than to show off how eloquent you were. You're way with words. And so you would give a speech, say, on like a mythological topic, whatever. And then third, and probably most important, legal. So ancient Athens, famously litigious society. And sidebar, what were they suing each other about? Well, the more things changed, like inheritance and injuries caused at drunken brawls. Literally, that's like a famous speech by Lysias. So, and these people were always in court. Part of it was structural. Anyone could initiate a civil or criminal suit. And so if you found yourself on either side of this as a litigant or defendant, usually you had to speak on your own behalf. And so if you find yourself there, you have 3 options. You got to speak in court, 3 options. First option is you hire a speechwriter who would write you a pretty speech. You still had to deliver it, but at least it was a pretty speech and you would do your best with it. Second, you could study rhetorical textbooks. You could learn these little tricks like tricolor, the rule of 3, these things that would have persuasive influence on your audience. These aren't mutually exclusive. And then third option would be to learn from something called a sophist. What is a sophist? new word, but also this was absolutely new at the time. The sophists were these traveling teachers for hire, and they would help. They promised to make you eloquent enough to speak in court. So they taught rhetoric, but they did something more. They promised that they could teach a kind of general curriculum, that they could impart wisdom, they could teach excellence. They basically, and they were pilloried for this at the time, but they basically embraced Escalante's idea. They promised that they could teach anyone anything. And this is the germ of our idea of the liberal arts, of a general education. In Latin, it becomes liberales artes, but it comes from the Greek enkycleos paideia, whence our word encyclopedia, which means a book with everything in it. All this means, enkycleos means circular, so it means like a well-rounded education. And it was the sophists promising that they could take anyone, take the most spoiled brat, and make him a good citizen, make him eloquent in court, persuasive, all of this, an engaged political citizen. It was they who invented this idea. So now Isocrates himself, he really was a sophist. He starts out as a legal speechwriter, and he founds the first, he's not a traveling sophist, so he founds like the first sedentary school of rhetoric. And Isocrates' MO is to expand rhetoric from just dealing with law to the general education of the citizen. And he calls what he's doing philosophy. So who else was saying what they were doing was philosophy? Was Plato. And Plato wins the war of words. Isocrates wins in education, as you're about to see. But Plato wins the war of words in terms of philosophy, because Plato was searching for these supralunar ahistorical truths that never change. And Isocrates was like, this is an absolute fantasy and a dead end for distraction. Forget it. And he called it wild abstraction, teratologia, fables, that kind of thing. What Isocrates was after was practical wisdom, to use an Aristotelian term, phronesis, stuff that we could use. In his school, he promised to create people who could effectively manage their private lives and the affairs of state. So this is very much on the ground, active, pragmatic education. Again, this is the birth of the liberal arts. And so our text, the Antidosis, he writes when he's not young, and his goal is to defend his curriculum against widespread doubt over whether education works. The promise that anyone could learn anything was hugely controversial. The sophists and Isocrates, they were accused of just being greedy, like saying, oh, you're educating people, you're taking money to educate people who cannot be taught. How do we know there was all this skepticism? Something called internal evidence. He says so. We have external evidence too, but we have lots of fascinating internal evidence that we're about to see. And his argument is that the mind, the psyche in Greek, is plastic. Not just some minds, not just those that are born a certain way or born talented, but the human mind is plastic. And his proofs are common sense. We see people when they work hard and study, and he's going to say this in our excerpt, they get better. And the body, when we stretch or strengthen the body gets stronger, the body changes. And animals, we see animals being trainable. And we'll meet all of these proofs in an entertaining way, I think, in our excerpt. Okay, text 2, Quintilian defends human potential. So now we're fast forwarding to imperial Rome, and we need a little bit of context of what's happening in education. So long story short, in the few hundred years that have passed, Isocrates wins. So the enkycleos paideia, that general education, is standardized in the Greek-speaking world after the 3rd century BC. And Alexander the Great then is an empire builder, and he spreads this into Asia Minor, into North Africa. And then the Romans adopt it, especially with the influx of Greek teachers looking for work after Rome officially fully conquers Greece at the Battle of Corinth in 146. So one way of thinking of this is that Isocrates is to the sophists as Quintilian is to Isocrates. So just like Isocrates wanted to take the sophist education, this idea of a general education, a gen ed, and make it bigger and standard, Quintilian wants to do the same with Isocrates in Rome. And this is, again, a gen ed that's centered on eloquence, on public speaking. Why learn, though? Good question. So we're not in Athens or the Roman Republic, so the opportunities to do political speech are much reduced. This is not the citizens' assemblies in the Roman Empire have been shut down. And of course, we're not in democratic Athens anymore. But legal oratory is alive and well. And so education trains lawyers, patronus in the singular, patroni in the plural, or bureaucrats, people who go into government. And as this was unfolding, though, the more things change, the more the same debates are happening. So debates over how much a child can learn, which children should learn. Should it just be the talented? And why study irrelevant subjects like music or acting? Who gets these questions when you tell people you do humanities? Why study that? What are you going to do with that? Yeah, both the question and the answer presuppose different models of mind, and we're about to meet that. But all of this is very much at play in answering and asking that question. So Quintilian puts Isocrates' curriculum on steroids. The goal now is to shape the weir, shape the human, the man, shape human nature itself. The curriculum should include everything from geometry to acting, and then of course it should center on rhetoric and literature. It's useful to keep in mind that in tracing the trajectory of a gen ed curriculum, that it's a trajectory, it's a genealogy. This isn't just intrinsically interesting over something that elapsed a long time ago and it's kind of cool to look at and pull apart. We are the legatees, both direct and indirect, of these earlier versions of liberal arts curriculum. And they went through various permutations in the Middle Ages, but we've inherited the practice. So a quote that I think captures this is, modernity's greatest ideological inheritance from Quintilian is the enduring belief that the study of the humanities, especially literature, represents a clear, if intangible, good. And he'll influence Adam Smith, John Quincy Adams, John Dewey, the 20th century philosopher and theorist of education who's had a big influence on how we do education in the English-speaking world. Now, Quintilian himself, born in Calahorra, Spain, the Emperor Vespasian makes him Rome's first publicly funded teacher of rhetoric. And he writes our text, the Institutio Oratoria, at the end of his career. Institutio Oratoria, it literally means an oratorical education. You might see orator's education. All of that these are fair translations. So Quintilian's vision for general education would have the child begin with educatio. This is upbringing, studying at home, doing reading, writing, basic math with a pedagogus, whence our word pedagogue. This was a slave who would accompany and teach elite young Romans. And then grammar school, primary school, when you're around 7 to 12, you do more literacy. Now you actually go to a place, you actually go to a school, and you do something called progymnasmata. You see that etymon, that little word gym in there, that just means exercise. So these were basic exercises. This comes from the Greek, and these were invented by the Greeks in persuasive writing and speaking. And then you go to high school, you go to rhetorical school. You're a teenager now. You do more progymnasmata. You do something called declamation. Now, this was hugely important. These were mock speeches on often mythological themes and mock debates, often on really soapy stuff. So murders, affairs, lots of action. It was a soap opera, and it was really controversial. Why are we teaching these kids this really unrealistic, salacious stuff with sex and all this stuff? And of course, the reason it was done is it was to entertain teenagers, to keep them engaged. And it worked, because declamation, it lasted, it was hugely popular, and there were declamation, adults would have declamation contests, and it was basically like a debate club, kind of. So Quintilian's answers to these debates that were happening, how much can a child learn? His answers, as you're about to see, are vast amounts. Which children should learn? Just the talented, so-called talented? No, emphatically no. Why study irrelevant subjects like music or acting? That question that you and I get at every third cocktail party, or by every third person at a cocktail party, or whatever. His answer, and this is crucial, is because this stuff sticks to the non-conscious mind for life. Because it sticks to the non-conscious mind for life. So there's an underlying concept and even metaphor of mind that this answer requires. So Quintilian says, study acting if you want to be an orator, study acting when you're 16. That way you're 36, find yourself in court. You have unconsciously inculcated compelling nonverbal communication. You don't have to think about it. It's there. Now, this might sound normal to us, to most of us, but it was totally controversial at the time. And how do we know that? Well, in part because Quintilian has to say it. He has to make the argument. Now, our third and final text is Longinus on how culture shapes bones. Longinus is fairly well known. Who's heard of Longinus or On the Sublime? If you hear the word sublime, it comes out of this text. Who was Longinus? We have no idea. The date and authorship of this text is a morass. I'm going to say 1st century CE. Russell says so. I'm just going to go with it. It was written in Greek. We know that. It's on the handout. It's on that out. Probably under the Roman Principate. As you're about to see, there are a lot of complaints about the suppression of political speech. So that's one of the reasons, one of the bits of internal evidence that makes us think that it was written in imperial Rome. But there was also political suppression in the Hellenistic state. So we just don't know. Part of the trouble is that no ancient author mentions Longinus's text, which puts us it makes it difficult to date. But whatever, that's not my interest. But what it also means is that this text had no influence on contemporaneous aesthetics, so far as we know. Conversely, though, it's been hugely influential on modern aesthetics. When you hear this, Kant's concept of the sublime, all of this was spurred by Longinus. So Boileau translates it into French in 1674 as du sublime, and this text soon becomes a defining force in cultural history. The next century and a half can't be grasped without taking into account the notion of the sublime in many areas of European culture. So I mentioned Kant, especially influential in romantic aesthetics, romantic thought. And people who specialize in that can probably tell you much, much more than I can as a classicist. So what we're going to look at is a little debate that's at the end of the existing text on what happened to talent, why there are no really talented people. And I know. And the debate is positioned as one between the author, we don't know who the author is, and between a philosopher. Was it real? Who knows? These are characters in the text for our purposes. And the philosopher's argument is that, well, there are no really talented people because we don't have free speech. And you can only develop talent if there are in the right political conditions. Our author says, well, not quite. It's cultural decay. It's something in the cultural air. We don't have the right values. Big idea is that both fundamentally agree that talent is not inborn, simply. That it's something, it's either socio-political structure or it's the mores. It's whatever in the cultural air. All right, so we're about to meet these texts. We're going to go around and read them. And I invite you again, write down your thoughts, questions, and epiphanies. And the way I think we'll do this is, I don't ever put people on the spot. I think we should go around, and if you don't feel like reading, just shake your head or say pass. Does that sound amenable to everyone? Okay, absolutely no pressure. And let's begin at the beginning with Isocrates. And should we start on my right? Dan, are you keen to start? We can start on my left. You have a handout? You can borrow mine. And just read a sentence. Read it until
yeah.
Here's the other thing I'll say: is read until it's a natural. But just read. Some of Isocrates is famous for being a long-winded blowhard a little bit, in the words of some critics. I don't necessarily agree, but he wrote these long periodic sentences. So stop whenever you like.
Sorry, read until when?
Until what feels to you like a natural pause, or until you feel
okay.
It.
Again, every one of you could name many of your schoolfellows who, when they were boys, seemed to be the dullest among their companions, but who, growing older, outstripped them farther in intelligence and in speech than they had lagged behind them when they were boys. From this fact, you can best judge what training can do, for it is evident that when they were young, they all possessed such mental powers as they were born with, but as they grew to be men, these outstripped the others and changed places with them in intelligence.
Because their companions lived dissolutely and softly, while they gave heed to their own opportunities and to their own welfare. But when people succeed in making progress through their own diligence alone, how can they fail to improve in a much greater degree, both over themselves and over others, if they put themselves under a master who is mature, of great experience, and learned not only in what has been handed down to him, but in what he has discovered for himself.
But there remain still other reasons why everyone may well be astonished at the ignorance of men who venture so blindly to condemn philosophy. For in the first place,
They know that paintings and industry give proficiency in all of their activities and arts, yet deny that they have any such power in the training of the intellect. Secondly, they admit that no physical weakness is so hopeless that it cannot be improved by exercise and effort. But they do not believe that our minds, which are naturally superior to our bodies, can be made more serviceable through education and suitable training. Again, they observe that some people possess the art of training horses and dogs and most other animals, by which they make them more spirited, gentle, or intelligent, as the case may be. Yet they do not think that any education has been discovered to train human nature, such as to improve men in any of those respects in which to improve the beasts. Nay, so great is the misfortune by which they impute to us at all, that while they would acknowledge that it is by our mental powers that every creature is improved and made them useful, yet they have the hardihood to claim that we ourselves were endowed with an intelligence to render all creatures of greater worth, cannot help each other to advance in excellence. The most absurd of all, they behold in the shows which are held year after year, lions, which are more gentle toward their trainers than some people are toward their benefactors, and bears which dance about and wrestle and imitate our skill, and yet they are not able to judge even from these instances the power which education and training have, nor can they see that human nature will respond more promptly than the animals to the benefits of education. In truth, I cannot make up my mind which should astonish us more, the gentleness which is implanted in the fiercest of wild beasts, or the brutishness which resides in the souls of such men.
Thank you. Okay. So now whoever, yes, we're gonna move on to Quintilian.
When his son is born, the father should form the highest expectations of him. He will then be more careful about him from the start. There is no foundation for the complaint that only a small minority of human beings have been given the power to understand what is taught. The majority being so slow-witted that they waste time and labor. On the contrary, you will find the greater number quick to reason and taught to learn. This is natural to man. As birds are born for flying, horses for speed, beasts to play for ferocity, so are we for mental activity and necessity. This is why the soul is believed to have its origin in heaven. Soul and unteachable persons are more normal products of human nature than prodigious and monstrous births, but these have been very few. The proof of this is that the promise of many accomplishments of children, and when the days of age, this is plainly due to the failure, not of nature, but of parents. But some have more talent than others, I agree, and some will achieve more and some less. But we never find one who has not achieved something by his efforts. A parent who grasps this has devoted the keenest possible care from the moment he becomes a parent to fostering the promise of the organization.
First of all, make sure the nurses speak properly. Chrysippus wished them, had it been possible, to be philosophers. Failing that, he would have us choose the best that our circumstances allow. No doubt the more important point is their character, but they should also speak correctly. These are the first people the child will hear. Theirs are the words he will try to copy and pronounce. We naturally retain most tenaciously what we learned when our minds were fresh. A flavor lasts a long time when the jar that absorbs it is new, and the dyes that change wool's pristine whiteness cannot be washed out. Indeed, the worse these impressions are, the more persistent they are. Good is easily changed to worse. Can you ever hope to change bad to good? So do not let the child become accustomed, even in infancy, to a type of speech which he will have to unlearn.
Now finally, Longinus.
One problem now remains for solution. My dear 79th and knowing your love of learning, I will not hesitate to abandon a problem which a certain philosopher recently put to me. It surprises me, so as it doubtless surprises many others too. How it is that in this age of ours, we can find natures that are supremely persuasive and suited for public life, truly versatile, and especially rich in literary charm. Yet really sublime and transcendent natures are no longer, or only very rarely accountable, such as the universal third of literature that invests our time. Are we really to believe that academic view that democracy is the kind of nurse of genius, and that speaking generally, the great men of letters will return to democracy and flourish to it?
Is a hospitality foster noble minds and devote them with titles, and at the same time develops our spirit of mental and ritual warrior. An eagle competition for the foremost place. Moreover, thanks to the prizes which a republic offers, and orator intelligence and intellectual gift on whether by practice.
However, our decision opens doors, it is easy to understand, and it is characteristic of human nature, I was sometimes want to be over and or figure that it is non-trivial feedback that it uses that when having a disagreement with one going to the person of their community passion, pressure, and around the belief and the other it is a rare and many increasable culture from the almost secular intellectual culture that in service or rather than have to receive our social care of person. For a lot of that community is
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to people who didn't get the chance to read, but you'll be able to make up for it by sharing lots of extra TQEs. All right, thank you everyone. So now what I'd like us to do is I've set the scene, hopefully, and we've read these three primary sources. We also had the video clip as a primary source as well, and I'd love for us to open up and have a discussion on what you thought was interesting, what was not interesting, whatever got you thinking. So who has the first T or the first Q or the first E? Yes, please.
I was talking about children and like how you're supposed to give care to children and really to like clean up the nurture side of it, right?
Yeah,
In order to like make their minds more susceptible to knowledge.
Yep.
I think like some of the way that people talk about children is they're like, oh, they're so stupid, they don't understand anything. but we just like sit them down in a corner alone and ignore them and give them worksheets, and then we expect them to like have these great theories about how the world works, and then just like completely ignore them. And I think when you take the time to like talk to a child and actually ask them questions and like respect them and give them the kind of way to actually have the very clever sentences to say. And I just like them using it because I'm always saying that to people and so really good reading.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that's exactly what Quintilian is trying to say. And clearly, a lot of people proceeded in the negative fashion that you described, because he has to say it and he's arguing it like hard. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
In the third reading by James, he said no slavery becomes an orator. Then he goes on to say that and that it's also what so what is it that keeps some people, what do you think is the biggest influence that keeps people from breaking that habit of people pleasing and adapting to society? Like, why are some more inclined to oppose what they were taught?
I think you want my personal opinion. I would say, and I think that Longinus would probably embrace this. I'd say awareness, always. Really, by the way, this is one of the most interesting descriptions of slavery that we have from the Greek world. It's a fascinating description, and one of the things that makes it so interesting is it's all about how slavery is how the people that were subject to slavery had no intrinsic defect, that it was culture, that it was the acculturation. Literally, it's the repeated beating of the habituation of being told you're a slave, not being able to do things, but then constrains the mind. And the verb that's being used is really interesting, anaxane, which means, and it uses this anaxane literally means to bubble up. So that means that the censorship that you learn as a slave becomes internalized, and it bubbles up and then deforms the way you're thinking. Absolutely nothing to do with the way you're born. It's totally cultural. So it's one of the most fascinating descriptions of slavery that we have. So I think the answer here would be, what would break the habit of that self-censorship from bubbling up in the mind, from an anaxane in the mind? Awareness. I'm sure it's always been back to awareness. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
I don't make related to the concept, but what I came here for is to have some questions to answer it, and it's about nature versus nurture. And so pretty much these, old time philosophers are just arguing about what is the most efficient, effective way to cultivate talent, and how to do that systematically in the institution and also individually on one-on-one basis as well. But more importantly, what I'm kind of trying to figure out is what's the effective way to implement that in a modern world, and then on top of that, what is the purpose of the said talent being cultivated for? How are they going to use the talent and today in society or back in the day, however you want to? So, yeah, I'm just confused on that part. So I'm not sure what they're trying to argue about in these passages.
You mean like what the kind of end game would be?
So yeah, like you said, the staircase, for like the singular staircase to the top.
Yeah.
My goal is to look at the bigger picture and as well as look at the details leading up to the big picture to see how that could affect and change today's society and the world that we live in.
Yeah. What a rich question. In terms of is one of the things that you're after like the utilitarian end? I mean, Socrates.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Morally, ethically, and all that type of stuff.
Yes. Okay. So I didn't say this because you can't cover every bad thing in a single presentation, but Socrates wanted to, his big MO, the reason he was not interested in Plato's chasing those literally super lunar entities, this is a little bit medieval, but like getting that these eternal truths, the reason he thought this was totally a dead end is he wanted to train citizens and then prepare the Greek world for the conquest of Asia. He wanted to invade, he wanted to start a war with the Persian Empire, essentially. And so when he couldn't find he became very sympathetic to the Macedonians, to to Alexander's family, essentially. And so he had a political project. He had an imperialist project. Absolutely. That was his end game. It depends on who we're talking about. Quintilian wanted, I would say, and I'm not a cultural historian, but he wanted to train young Roman males to perform good young Roman maleness. So he just wanted to regularize mores. This was not necessarily that political a person. He was a political player in that he had to survive and make a living by living under these really murderous, crazy emperors. And he ended up adopting and educating the sons of a particularly bad one. But unlike Socrates, it wasn't to like Spartans, to create an army to invade people. And then Longinus, we don't know. We don't really know exactly where this was written. What impressions do you have, I would ask?
Oh, from Longinus and the rest.
In general, yeah.
I think Plato comes from more of a theoretical standpoint, and Socrates from a pragmatism standpoint. And to me, I always like to have the emphasis on balance, because you can't be one or the other. You're like Socrates, you're focusing on pragmatism and like these academics and like being strong, learning how the world works and conquering. Then you kind of get too caught up in that, I guess you want to say, colonizer mindset of just traveling and taking resources and all that type of stuff. But then on Plato's end, it's more like you're sitting back and you're saying, wait, what purpose, what goal, why are we doing these? What is it for? Is it for the benefit of us? Is it benefit for others? Is it the expense of others? Will this help us in the long term or the short term? And so these two people are like arguing between what's the best way to implement ideas into, I guess, individuals, and then using that for their own like agenda.
Yes.
And like how to get to that, how comes from that agenda. And so I think many people based off of these two, like all of the philosophers that come in modern time have used these two like mainly as their core foundations, which is built upon all of these questions. And now we're coming to the end stage in modern times where we're like pretty much asking, okay, so how do we like what now, right? We know all these things, we have all this information, but like how are we going to use it effectively to help others and help ourselves to get to a better tomorrow? And I think you can't just, I think it takes a balance of you being out in the streets and being outside and traveling and seeing how things will work in real times. And then also like us, what we're doing today is sitting here, having these dialogues and conversation and getting just different ideas and opinions from different backgrounds and their experiences and how that cultivates into having a more diverse shared experiences amongst us in a peaceful manner, of course. Yeah. So yeah, like that's just, so like when I come to philosophy and I come to like science, I come to education, academic, when I want to learn something, I always think to myself, how does this apply to today and how can we translate like stuff that we know that back then, make it accessible to modern times and make it easier for us, like how is that possible? And I think if you don't ask that constantly as a philosopher, then it's like, what are you asking? What are you getting at? What are you even trying to understand about this world and yourself and God and or anything else in the universe, blah, blah, blah. If you're not asking these questions and also actively, putting actions behind it as well. So yeah, that's just my take.
Thank you. Wow, that's wonderful, wonderful food for thought. And of course, you're absolutely right on that pragmatism is the exact right word to describe us on.
And I think the core of what you brought up, the cultural and socio-political thing when it came to like raising up certain individuals because of that message, that's heavily seen, especially in Asian cultures today. The cultural aspect stops people from growing and understanding more just from like social stigmatism or like the way that like image purposes, right? Like a lot of people, if you're so image oriented, then you just miss out on a lot of truths and a lot of like good stuff. And I think trying to cultivate like a child from like, to being a grown adult, how you speak to the child is very important. What they're surrounded by academic wise and the people there are, like the characters of the people around them is very important. And on top of that, like making them more diverse and not like having them try out different subjects. Like for example, Roger Federer, some famous GOAT, tennis player. This guy tried every single sport, even though he was like his mom was like a famous tennis player, right? And he's like, he's just, why not just focus on tennis? Your mom's a famous tennis player. She can give you insights. You can easily become the best. But he tried so many different sports, so many different kinds of sports until he landed back into tennis and made him the top 3 best tennis player. And his story is a perfect example of how to cultivate talent right there. Is he didn't just focus on tennis, he had a variety diverse range of experience and we use that to the advantage. So that could be like from my Socrates standpoint, practical, like taking that and cultivating that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. That's like the athletic version of an incomplete idea, right? I love that. That's so true. That's so great. Any other yes, please.
Okay, so we kind of have to go and play the creativity talent, but I'm gonna get a little back to the beginning of the presentation. When you were talking about the beginning of like teaching people how to talk, and it's because like words and things like that have power. And then connecting it to the way I saw things created a school and like why once they hit a bigger age, they started with the whole job and the social stuff. And you said it was because to keep them interested. But I also think that when you come to talk to someone or you're coming to the office, you're a performer. You have to know how to like convey emotions through your words. And like, I don't know if you guys have ever met anyone where you're talking to them and they're hanging on by every word because it's like they're performing for you. And the words make much of a bigger impact. And I realized that the more you like you reference to things, like for example, you reference to both, like, oh yeah, there's something right? And then the whole idea of celebrity talent, it's like we have nowadays we have celebrity people, right? And they're talented people because they wouldn't be where they are talented. But that's why we care about these things. Especially what happens in media, they're like, oh, why didn't like Taylor play music? So that's how we can make the talent and so why aren't you saying something? I want to know what you have to say to your talent and you're important. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot in there. I love any pop culture. But I will say that defensive declamation is totally apropos, and it was. I think you're absolutely right. Someone would say it wasn't just to entertain these teenagers; it was to teach them pathos, teach them how to speak emotionally. Yes, these were supercharged, like crazy themes, murders and affairs and all that kind of thing. But if you're able to kind of juice your and the audience's emotions by playing with that stuff, then when you get in court arguing like real stuff, which may be a little bit less soapy, then you have that skill. Absolutely. And Cotillion actually has a whole section describing the emotions. He was absolutely after this.
They'll teach rhetoric in that way. That's why like your junior high school, they're like taking AQA, they're gonna be like to start with another really great at that too. You're so like literature, but it's like it helps you like
I do want to say that, so Socrates' perspective on philosophy is more in certain eras, or maybe teaching theater or the way to express emotion and how to talk is more influential in the community. So it's important in a restricted space and in your immediate community. It could be like in the country, but still, it's really restricted. I like Plato's perspective more because he's after inner truths. Because there are some, I believe that there are some universal truths that work no matter what era, what communities, what language, whatever barrier they break them, and they work in whatever time. It just they're more like truths that are inherent, maybe not even just humans, but maybe to all organisms. I like his philosophy more and his way of thinking about philosophy in general, to get down to the inner truths of the universe. So Socrates might be more practical, but everybody sometimes, in whatever kind of struggles you go through, sometimes, a lot of the time you ask yourself, what's the end goal? Yeah, a lot of people ask themselves that question. I think maybe probably everybody. And if you ask yourself that question, you're probably thinking about it from Plato's point of view. And it gets down to a really important aspect of our universe. And I just like I don't have anything against Socrates' point of view, but I feel like Plato's point of view is more in tune with philosophy, because in my opinion, philosophy wants to discover the truths of life. And so I like his perspective more.
Yeah. Very fair. Absolutely very fair. Thank you. Yeah.
I was just hoping you might, so I have a bunch of questions and I think there's a lot of cool stuff here, but just one that might help me and maybe others too, is you started to talking about different views of how history might work, and in particular, it sounded like you were pretty critical of the idea that there was some teleology in history, and maybe more generally, there's teleological features in any form of development, or maybe you don't even like development, maybe that's not a thing. But so I was just curious how you're envisioning that part of your presentation, and then the debate on education. Like how are you seeing those two parts come together? Because I think they're both fascinating issues, but it's not totally clear to me just at the first pass. If we decided the question about nature versus nurture, and presumably these authors are kind of like, yeah, nature has some component of it, but nurture plays a big role.
Yeah.
Does that give us any guidance on the question about whether history or development can head towards ends? Or is it maybe supposed to go the other direction? Yeah, just any exploration you could.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the kind of poking holes in the developmentalist view of history, my point there was to get us off the staircase so that we have enough humility to recognize that we just really basically that we aren't the first people to grapple with these moral issues of human potential. And then to get us motivated to say, to look at how these people, other times were dealing with these, not just, oh, that's intrinsically interesting, but, oh, maybe they are voicing ideas that we are only thinking of tacitly. Or maybe these debates and the way that they're having them can shed new and interesting light on our own debate. So that's my most basic motivation. And I think that the other reason for framing that is that for framing this talk by kind of pushing against a teleological view of history would be to just break us out of that myopic lens. I think that's the motivation. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I should just share as an anecdote. Like I'll have like a class, and it'll have a bunch of historical readings. And I've had students before be like, "Why are we reading anything that is from the past?" As though, presumably, that folks in the past didn't have like useful minds, or that they don't have ideas that are important and worth considering. So is that maybe just the kind of position you're pushing back against, is that we should be open to listening to what other folks have thought in the past, and that they might have insights that could be of use or important to us?
Absolutely, yeah. And so, and I was hoping my goal was to use it as a vehicle by which to invite us to do thick descriptions of the value of looking at how they themselves understood their world. So close reading of texts, and yeah, to basically get us off of the top of the staircase, where I think we often are more often than not implicitly. A lot of this stuff, people would be embarrassed to say, oh yes, we've definitely arrived at the end of history. You certainly wouldn't hear that after the 2000s, after the rocky last couple of decades. But tacitly, I think that a lot of these ideas are still at play, very much. Thanks.
Add on to that.
Yeah.
I think he has a very good point there, learning from the past. The only thing that I struggle with when it comes to like using history is like the use of technology. Since it's so different throughout historical time, we can learn like moral like lessons from stories from the past. But like understanding how they effectively use technology for their benefit is not the same as today because of the information age and what we have with technology. It's like completely different. It's like something so new that we're trying to like wrestle with and tackle, that like I think you really need to have like a very moral and ethical discussion about technology, because a lot of problems kind of, I don't want to say all of it, but some of it do stem from technology use in itself. What we're seeing today.
Yeah.
That's the only thing what it is.
That's such a key point. So I do history of ideas, intellectual history. That's the kind of vantage point. The danger is that we don't pay attention to material practices. Technology, of course, and you know this, material practice, right? Old school Marxians, the base, all the stuff, the what's happening with the mode of means of production, all this hugely important, right? And so we can't do a history of ideas pretending that we're up in some superlunar realm or whatever. Doesn't work. That's not real. That's not reality. Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is very interesting. Thank you for this. I guess I'm wondering, you said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so this is, of course, a perennial debate. But it strikes me as one where, like, is there any real debate here, like a real debate? Like, it seems like everybody acknowledges that people learn, they get better. If you go to sheep raising school, you get better at raising sheep, all the classic examples. But, some people are taller, some are shorter, right? Some are faster, and it's even in here, they're kind of acknowledging it, that, one of the authors,
Yeah.
said, but some have more talent than others. I agree, then some will achieve more and some less. But so it's like, all right, there's going to be some variation, but we can still push as far as we can and elevate everybody within their potential. And it's like, I think Plato would agree with all that. So like, is it just like a knob turning debate, like how much nature versus nurture? Like, is there any real disagreement?
Yeah.
Who's disagreeing? Who's being disagreed with?
Yes.
Besides a few extreme figures.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely onto the crux of the issue, and that is that it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum in each of these authors. I think the concessions to innate talent that we meet in these texts are often just that. They're concessions so that these people don't. It's in Isocrates. It isn't in our excerpt, but Isocrates does the same thing, where he says, "Yes, of course, I believe in innate something. I'm not totally an extremist. I don't think that everyone's exactly the same, but my big curriculum still works." So what I'll say is, so yes, there's going to be a spectrum from a really extreme empiricism where everyone is literally a blank slate. That's kind of what Steven Pinker, if one reads that book, that's what he pushes back against. I think it's a straw man. I don't think anyone's arguing that really. And it almost requires taking the metaphor literally. So it's a little bit of a straw man. And then, of course, on the other side would be that everything is totally fixed in some sense. In terms of Plato, yeah, I guess he would agree in part, but his vision of education was pretty elitist. It would condemn most people to being unteachable. I would also say that his metaphysics are learning for Plato. For Plato, the big conundrum is, how can we learn if we don't already know something? And his answer is that, well, so they didn't have biology, they didn't have DNA yet, but it's really a version of DNA. His answer is, oh, well, we're remembering eternal truths from past lives when we were disembodied souls floating. He believed in reincarnation. So, and certain souls were more advanced. This depends on where they were in the cycle. It's like 10,000 years or whatever. So certain people would have more access. Smarter people by birth would be people who had more of this metaphysical DNA in their unconscious. That's pretty different from the models of mind that we're seeing at work in these texts. I'll also say that, I mean, again, it can't be stressed enough that the sophists promise that they could teach anyone anything. I mean, basically, it's Jaime Escalante's idea. That was hugely controversial. Fathers were told that and if you look at Aristophanes' comedies and that kind of thing, fathers were told that they were absolutely wasting money to scam artists to send their sons to be educated by these people. So yeah, they're definitely, I think you're absolutely right. It's a spectrum. There was a debate. And when we see, part of it is just like common sense, internal evidence. When we see them breaking a sweat to make these arguments, there's a reason they're doing so. There's always a reason. And they wouldn't have written this, Quintilian wouldn't have written out, I mean, and all these texts are kind of making the same argument from different contexts and different styles and personality types. They wouldn't have done it if they didn't have critics, basically. Thank you. Okay.
One response that I can think of for the question of was the debate, besides a debate of extremes. Say in the middle, we all know that we can learn anything. But it gets, if you put in the factor of age, it gets really hard. So as you age, you learn less. Your ability to learn is less. And I think this is a really important debate for those type of people, for people in that category. So to have this debate more and more, you can teach them that you can be a lifelong learner. A lot of great people that I admire, they're always learning throughout their whole entire life. And one thing nowadays, people joke around about, oh, I'm stupid, they have negative connotations about themselves. And we think it's just because it's just a jokey thing, it's okay, people, everybody says it, but then it has an effect on them constantly. And I think this debate that we have more, it might help people who want to learn, but we think that they're a bit too old to learn something. But in reality, because they can learn anything, it just might be a little harder, but it's still very attainable. And to be a lifelong learner is a very beautiful thing. And we should always strive for it. So it could be a nice debate for people in that category.
There's a person in the room, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful point.
I have a question about the old people being able to learn less and less. I get that age is a factor and the, your brain deteriorates over time, but how much of it is based off of your, deteriorating and going to old age versus having a fixed mindset of I don't know, age based on what you already know and your values and beliefs, and just being able to not be able to admit that you're wrong. Because what would that mean? What would that say about the things I've done in the past and things leading up to this moment? If I admit that this one instance, like I'm incorrect in this instance, and I think it's a bit of both. I don't think it's one or the other, but I think depending on who you ask, someone could just be very closed off and not have an open mind. And with the neuroplasticity thing, they probably don't use that to their advantage to learn better, because there's a neuroscience by Dr. Nuture and Labo at Stanford. He always talks about neuroplasticity, and he says that is the key to continuous learning even in old age, no matter what. As long as you keep changing your mind, in terms of neuroplasticity, you can always continue learning no matter what. Even if you have and also prevents dementia and all the other stuff in schizophrenia if you keep at it. So yeah, that's just my question.
Yeah.
Of that.
Yeah. Yes, please.
There's so many interesting things that we can gather. Thank you. But and it seems to me that your main reason this idea and at least for me, I feel a lot of you put in that here. So I'm curious about how the market is playing a role in your thinking of society.
Yeah. Well, I love both. I mean, Charles Taylor is, a giant in the history of ideas. I think I encourage everyone to dip in. His Sources of the Self is really good. His Secular Age is really good. You can even disagree with his big argument there that Protestantism develops out of monk orders in Catholicism, whatever. It's a fascinating, just really rich history of ideas. So he's worth checking out. What I would say is, one remark that I would say on postmodernism is that, and I don't know if this kind of answers your question sideways, but the thinking that we're studying here foreshadows a lot of constructivist postmodern thought, because these guys were pragmatist. They didn't really have they didn't have a conscious metaphysical program. They believed that it was culture, that everything was culture. These were culturalists. Culture is the big the big independent variable, as opposed to other variables. So if we're going to do a big history of postmodern or constructivist thought, it would start with these guys. It would start with the sophists. It would start with these people who in looking at what it is that shapes human lives, who put the thumb on culture, basically. And that's what we're seeing here. I don't know if that answers your question in part. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You related to previous time we talked about, but after you Matt, you read you can learn about history and growth minutes. Why do we keep seeing the same things in history over and over?
This is for me. It's a great question. So I'm not an expert on ethics or I mean, what I would say is that a lot of these, I'll answer from kind of a phenomenological perspective. A lot of these are perennial problems that any living human being is going to encounter. Questions such as, how much can we adapt to our environment? Will I be able to meet this challenge with the equipment, the mental, physical equipment that I have? Will my children? These are kind of facts of our existence in the world. That's my answer. So that's why we're repeating this stuff. another reason, and I think this is just a cliche, which I think is true, we repeat things to the extent that we forget them. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So this was the idea was to get us not so confidently at the top of the stairs, and to get us excited about seeing history as an invitation to maybe how we could talk and think and do differently. It's as simple as that. So I basically framed that in a way as to get us to be open-minded, essentially, as opposed to being at the top of the stairs and thinking, oh, that's really cute, or that's really interesting, or this would be just this has just intrinsic interest. No, it's more than that. Thanks. Yeah.
I think you just touched on something that I was thinking about, which is the idea of open-mindedness. I think that we live in a day and age where we think that to be open-minded is to only look to the future, like what could be, but we tend to be very closed-minded in terms of the past. So like when we want to change, and like yes, there's things that need to change in the past. And was not great all the time in the past in history, but there was also a lot of very beautiful like traditions and things that really could have value to us that we seem to like toss in with like the plague and like not washing our hands. That's like so ridiculous things that we used to do. And I think there's just like a narrative of like when people want to bring up the past, people tell them that they're closed-minded, but they're doing so closed-mindedly. I mean, obviously there's some people who are like so traditional that they won't let go of the past, you know, the future, but there has to be like, it has to be reciprocal in a way.
Yes, you said it. That's great.
Your points about how like there could be other ways of being now, that we learn from these things. And one of the things that I really liked was this idea that the culture, as you mentioned now, and then in some of the pieces, like a freedom, or like the fact that you've got the bubble mindset or whatever you said, there are things in the culture structure that could be preventing learning. I do think that there's some value in this work on listening, like, and democracy. I think is part, you know, but if we can become better knowers in a certain structure, in a certain structural environment. Just curious if you had other thoughts about what we could do culturally or structurally to help engage learning. Would it, like maybe from this or from your own thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a big believer in a general education. I think that the more we learn, the more we can learn. I think one thing that I'll say about learning, the age debate, and I think that most neuroscientists would agree with me, that yes, the mind becomes a little bit less plastic over time, but conversely, we have more reference points. So we have more of these structures that we can learn. That's why, like, as you learn more languages when you're older, you have these grammatical structures that you can that make learning language that accelerate it. So yes, the mind is a little bit less spongy, but you also you've gained reference points. I'm a big believer in a broad-ranging education, an education that isn't focused primarily on utilitarian ends, because I think paradoxically that ends up being most useful. Because I really do think that the things that we learn will end up, I mean, just think about it. So often when you learn something and you do it you learned it in a class, or you read a book that's interesting, and you're not really, it just kind of piques your interest. You're not using it for any project at the time. How often is it that 6 months later, you actually find that information useful? And I think that happens all the time with us. And I think it's just a good rule to go by. I think that the things that we learn they don't just train the mind. They don't just make it, you know, the mind is like a muscle. They don't just make it stronger and more able to learn. They also will help make us give us a richer store of information with which to meet the world and engage with people and be more open-minded. I just think there's intrinsic value that will end up being utilitarian in that, if that helps at all. So I guess I'm promoting a liberal arts education, and I think it could benefit everyone. Yeah.
Oh,
yes. Please.
Sorry. I was just curious. I feel like in this kind of idea of like innate talent versus like you can work hard to become good at something is like sorry. I can kind of see like this kind of debate in this like from my experience in like modern education where like somebody will maybe be more talented at something like at the onset of learning it, right? And then you might feel like sorry, see the difference in that talent, and people go like, oh well, he's just good at that, and like you'll find your own thing that you're good at. And so I'm kind of wondering if this idea of like has any like underlying critique of like modern education and how we treat people who may have like innate gifts, because it seems like I don't know, it seems like there can be a conflict between them, because I feel like a lot of people can be held back by this notion that some people are just good at certain things, and it's, even though it may be an uphill battle, like they're still able to excel in these things. And I was wondering if like maybe in this like debate there was like a critique of that idea or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think IQ itself, and I think if you look at a lot of like educational psychologists, it's kind of a moving target, and a lot of them kind of don't believe in it. There are clearly multiple intelligences. Clearly, we know that IQ, it's not so static. We know that childhood nutrition influences it hugely, actually. I think genius and talent is very often a function of interest. So when you have these people who are geniuses, well, they've been doing it since they were 3 years old for 5 hours a day after school plus, right? I am not a huge believer in it. I think a lot of it's a myth. Clearly, like with most myths, there's a kernel of truth. But I think very often we just kind of say, oh, yes, this person's interested in. I think very often, and not even forget genius. That's like an extreme example. Very often the things we're good at, I think we can be good at all kinds of things. Things we're good at more often than not are a function of what we find interesting. I really, really do. And I found that in my own life, where I thought I really wasn't good at something, and then it turns out, well, I really just am lazy with that thing I'm not good at. I don't like it. Exactly. And then the converse is true, and then the middle ground is true as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
So one solution I can think of to the previous question of how to teach better or how to something like that. I think it's so the thing I see that I notice that I observe is that people lack role models, so they like guidance. And in a world like this, where there's so much information coming in, it's really hard to filter out. And then we're moving to a new age so quick, like AI, so quickly. And we haven't passed that up for a long time to predict what's going to happen, or to have good facts about learning. I think it's really good to have good role models, and really passionate teachers really make a big difference. A lot of people who are experts in their field usually have been helped or pushed towards that field by someone, usually a professor, who really excited them about the subject. And Professor Miguel really increased my interest in machine learning, and some other teachers in my class too. And I'm like getting towards that. And I see that sometimes, because we engage so much in social media, bad role models come up. And I think to counteract that, having good role models who guide you in real life is going to be more impactful. So instilling really passionate teachers might be a really good idea.
Yes. Yeah.
So I wanted to bounce off of that. There was something you mentioned earlier, and I forget who said it, but it was the idea that the primary source of education is at home from the parent. And I remember taking AP US history, and we talked about Republican motherhood, not in the political sense of Republican, and that's against the time, but it was the idea that like the mother from a young age, because she's home with her children, should like teach them French and teach them how to play the piano and all these things that like if you foster in a child early on the idea that like learning is enjoyable and they get it from somebody that they love, then it takes them on the path. Like, it just gets instilled in you. Like I know a lot of people who like even with immigrant parents, they can speak a lot of English and they live in the best area. Their parents, just by virtue of telling them like education is important and teaching them even stuff at home, how to cook, how to take care of plants, all that stuff, those people are like so successful because they have ingrained in them this idea that like learning is enjoyable. And I just think that it's sad now because we do this thing where we're like children go to school to learn and that's just it. Like they don't even want to help their kids with their homework. They're like, that's the teacher's job or something like that. It's really harmful in my opinion because it kind of like it counteracts that. I really get upset when the children have that kids.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I'm not an expert in modern educational anything. I would say is that almost always exactly what you're saying, that it seems like our performance in school is going to reflect the attitude toward education at home. And if the attitude is, oh, it's a division of labor of the teachers, it should be taken care of all kind of in a classroom, and then when you're done, no, come home and just do chores or whatever. That's very different from one where education has always been happening kind of in tandem, or families where they make, and this is what they found so often determines school performance, and this isn't rocket science, but the best students are the ones where they come home and the whole family does homework for an hour and a half at the kitchen table. It's not IQ, it's not innate anything, it's that it's a ritual, doing homework together. And that really is what they found with, it has been one of the biggest determinants of children's performance in school. Absolutely.
I had a question about this first line in text 2, that activities on your feelings, your father is your feelings, the house expectations. I feel like things like this, wanting to make expectations with people in order to get into unwanted and miserable outcomes, like say, I think you kind of wrong to want your child to be the next LeBron James, just something like that is extremely unlikely. It takes like a certain amount of work ethic, talent, love, such that like it just never happen. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So the LeBron in Roman oratory would be like Cicero, and that was Quintilian's role model. And so I definitely think he would agree with you. No, don't expect your child to become the next Cicero. That notwithstanding, you still need to acknowledge the fact that it's very rare that a child is born without human potential. He says it's as rare as, a monstrous sign, a monstrous omen or whatever. And so he really did believe that our potential is sufficiently there, sufficiently plastic, that parents should not say, oh, I'm only going to pay attention to kids that seem really precocious when they're 3 years old. That no, the second they're out of the womb, we need to be paying extra attention to them because this is a human being, and human beings, as Socrates would say, just like any other animal, are hugely trainable and have huge potential. Yeah.
I remember watching a video of a professor that brought up an interesting point. I'm not sure if it was a study done on it or if this was from him, but he said, like, he made a graph and he said, if you expect high expectations from a person, right, then the result would be like, they would end up as they are. Like they want to maybe make up to here, but they'll get here to where they're at. But if you expect them to be as they are, then their expectation may be like leading down to here, and they're like, I'm not sure if that's true or not. Well, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. But like, is that a thing? If you think someone highly of someone that maybe they may not be the best, but they'll be better than than if you didn't have a high expectation of them.
Yeah, shoot for the moon. If you don't get it, you're still going to get much higher than someone who didn't shoot for anything. Yeah, absolutely. I think we know that that's anecdotally true.
So you think that's what the pastor was referring to when he said set the high expectations? They're like, even if he doesn't get there, it's fine where he lands as he will if he continues to keep moving forward.
That's very much in line with what the kind of thing Killing would say. He was very much a moderate. He wasn't an extremist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to say, like, yeah, I agree that we need to have some expectations for those that we need to be and we same high expectations and
Most social unrest on a big scale comes from expectations that aren't met. When you have lots of young people who have been educated and there are no jobs, this is a recipe for revolutions across the board. Exactly what you're saying. So yes, so unmet expectations can lead to all kinds of problems. So yes, they have to be managed to be psychologically palatable for people's well-being. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.